Okay, so Trenton, let's get started. And I want to just officially, it sounds like Joan, some of you already know Trenton, but I want to officially welcome Trenton, my co-host today. I'm Lisa A. Rowe, the director of FairVote Washington. Trenton and I are both volunteers, and Trenton and I have worked together doing some in-person presentations, and we also are just now learning to take our show onto the online format. So Trenton, let's see, I guess maybe I should say one or two more things about myself, and then I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. So I'm coming from a background of being a math teacher for my professional career, and I'm new to this sphere of political organizing, advocacy, electoral reform, and it's really fun to work on ranked choice voting, I got to tell you. How about you, Trenton? A little about you?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Yakima, Washington. I moved here to Spokane about 7 years ago, and really got involved in paying a bit more attention to politics about 2 years ago, specifically around the environmental movement and trying to advocate for policies around climate change. But it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that in order to get the kind of things passed that we need to get passed, we really have to address some of the core issues with our democracy itself. And a lot of that comes down to the way that we vote for people. And I kind of fell onto ranked choice voting and thought it was a great way to improve our system.
Fantastic.
And also an easy way because it's not really that far out of our grasp at this point.
Good. Well, that's a great segue to our next slide here. And I see we're welcoming Caitlin has just arrived. Great. Glad to have you here, Caitlin. We're just getting started. So Trent, you and I have been talking a lot about just, why is it that people would be interested in working on ranked choice voting right now in the midst of all the things that are calling for our attention as activists, as concerned citizens. And, one of the things that's so interesting about this time in our democracy is that there are people all over the country, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, there's this broad agreement that our government isn't working as well as it could be. And because our Constitution leaves it to we the people to address, dysfunctions, difficulties along the way. We're a work in progress as a nation. We know that. It's really up to the people. The states are the laboratories of democracy, and the Constitution expressly leaves elections to the states. Is an interesting piece of knowledge if you weren't aware of that already. So, Trenton, why don't you just tell briefly what happened in Maine in 2016 that is, in alignment with this idea of the states being laboratories of democracy?
Well, Maine decided to become the first state to adopt ranked choice voting. They adopted it by a ballot initiative, and they decided that they wanted to do something different and become not necessarily a place of experimentation, but just really push for ranked choice voting. So the people of Maine voted to adopt that, and now they are using ranked choice voting.
Yeah, so the reason why they decided to do that, we'll have a look at that a little bit during this presentation, but it kind of gets down to this question, and I have for you, Trenton, I know you and I have talked about this, but have you ever had, when you've gone to vote, felt like your vote just doesn't really matter? Is that something you've experienced?
All the time. And especially when you get into paying attention to a lot of specific policies or things that you want. Sometimes it's really difficult to vote for the candidate that you want, and often you're left with two choices or choices that you're not very satisfied with. So a lot of the times I want to vote for someone and I don't feel like my vote counts. And that kind of leads us to this where a lot of times I feel like I'm wasting my vote, especially one good example is our presidential votes here in Washington State. Often they're not really, doesn't make a huge difference. And we saw that in the primary this year as well, due to how many candidates dropped out this year after we received our ballots. We had almost 400,000 people waste their votes.
Yeah, that was the picture here. We have a slide up of the ballot that we all got in early March, which seems like an eternity ago already, doesn't it? And because a lot of folks mailed in their ballots early, which is generally a good idea, for almost 400,000 voters in our state, they realized that after they sent in their ballots, one or more of the candidates, potentially that they voted for had dropped out. So more than 25% of the votes got wasted in that election for candidates who were no longer in the race. I'm just going to pause really quickly here just to remind you all, in fact, I think I forgot to say it, because we're a relatively small group, this is not one of those huge webinars where we're going to keep you muted. You may unmute yourself, and you may also put questions in the chat box, and Trenton and I are actually really happy to have you chime in if you have a question as we go. We're happy to hear those. So wasted votes is one of the reasons that the state of Maine could have, one of the reasons certainly that they were deciding to try to use ranked choice voting now going forward. Well, wasted votes can come up in other ways besides this, when you mail in an early ballot and your candidate drops out. That's one way, obviously. But Trenton, if you could move to the next slide, would you like to talk us through this example?
Yeah, so one good example of wasted votes occurred in Oregon in 1990. They had a governor's race. And in that race, they had a strong third-party candidate who decided to run. So we have a Democrat, Roberts, a Republican, Frondmeyer, and then that third-party candidate, Al Mobley, who was a more conservative-leaning candidate and shared a lot of similar views with Frondmeyer, though he decided to run himself because he thought there was enough of a difference between the two of them. Mm-hmm. He was a strong enough candidate, though, that he ended up gaining 13% of the vote, which meant that Roberts was able to win without the majority of the vote. She only received 45% of the vote, and leaving a lot of speculation that potentially a lot of those votes that had gone to Al Mobley might have gone to the Republican Frondmeyer. Thus, that made Al Mobley the spoiler candidate, which is very possible just by some of the ideology and viewpoints that the two candidates shared.
Yeah. So even though more than half the voters wanted a conservative in that race, because there were two candidates who had similar conservative views, they split up the vote, and the Democrat won that race. So people who wanted Al Mobley, really would have gone through that same quandary that you were talking about, Trenton, really feeling like, if I vote for the candidate I like best, I'm going to waste my vote. Yeah, you go ahead and say this.
Yeah. So, you're really left with this idea of, do I vote with my heart and vote for Al Mobley and waste my vote, or do I kind of plug my nose and vote for the lesser of the two evils, voting strategically, which really just doesn't feel great. I know a lot of people who don't like to vote just because they're not happy with either of the options, but they feel like they have to vote for the Democrat or the Republican. And I think it's a big reason why we have lower turnout in this country is the lack of feeling like we have true options to vote for who we want. Yeah,
pretty discouraging as a voter. So here in Washington, we've improved things a little bit over what was going on there in Oregon in 1990, was that? Because we don't elect our governor with less than half the vote, right? Here in Washington, we have top two. So we're always going to make sure that whoever wins that general election actually does have a majority. But Trenton, what have we solved the vote splitting and the spoiler problem in Washington?
Not quite. It is better But as soon as we get above 4 candidates, this really breaks down in similar ways to the spoiler example that we showed before. And we've got a good example here of the Washington State Treasurer primary in 2016. There were 3 strong Democrat candidates and 2 strong Republican candidates. But those 3 Democrats split the vote amongst themselves so evenly that the top 2 candidates were actually both of the Republicans. So that occurred in the primary. And so when the time came that we reached the general election, the only options that the people who were voting in that general had were the 2 Republican candidates.
Yeah, and that clearly wasn't an expression of the wishes of the majority of the voters, since more voters wanted a Democrat than wanted a Republican. So that, again, we can see that even, with our top 2 system, we still have problems with vote splitting, people feeling like their votes are wasted, their votes aren't mattering.
Yeah, and real quick, one of the shames of that is that the system punishes coalitions when they run too many candidates. So if you're a party where you've got lots of different groups and you want to run multiple candidates because maybe you can't agree upon who the best candidate is, you are punished by doing that. And so you're discouraged from running those candidates, which is unfortunate.
So it's like those 3 Democrats, by running all together under the same party label, they actually punished and weakened each other, and they all lost because of that. Yeah. So having more choices, which might look like a good thing for the voters, turns out to be not a good strategy for the party. Yeah. Okay, so I'm feeling kind of discouraged. These are a lot of problems with our current system. How can we improve this?
Well, that's why we're here. That's why we've got you all on this call. We're here to talk about ranked choice voting, which is a simple alternative way for us to vote, is an improvement to the way we vote, where instead of being limited to choosing just a single candidate, you get to rank your options. You say, this is my first choice, my second choice, third choice, so on and so forth. And we do this type of ranking all the time.
Yeah, so if I'm going to the market and I'm looking for some apples, I'll look for Granny Smith's first. But if I don't find those, I'm good with Fuji's. That's my second choice. And if I don't find those, I really like those Cosmic Crisps. I'll look for those too. Yeah.
Yeah, and what a shame would it be if you showed up at that apple market and you only had 2 apples that you could choose from?
Oh, that would be such a bummer. Can you imagine a top 2 apple market? So the market owner just decides what are the best 2, and I only get to choose between them. Yeah, no, that would be no fun.
Especially not in Washington State.
Good. Well, Trenton, you and I have done a bunch of presentations in person before, and when we're all in the room together, we have one way that we like to go through the vote, and it's very interactive. We have people stand up and move around. But since we're off in our own houses right now, we're going to go through the vote with an explanation. But you've got an example I know that you've cooked up here from Spokane. You want to talk us through this?
Yeah, so here in Spokane, we held an election recently to try and vote, and we had 100 voters participate. And so in order to win with ranked choice voting, you need the majority. That is a requirement, the majority of votes. That is a requirement of ranked choice voting. So in order for our candidates to win, that candidate needs 51 votes. And so we voted for our favorite animal. And so you see here we've got 5 candidates. We've got the cat, the dog, the otter, the horse, and the cow. And after the first round, the cat was in the lead with 39 votes. But no candidate has the majority. No candidate has at least 51 votes, which means...
So
Yep.
So go ahead. We're just going to pause here and make sure everybody's with us, and please don't feel at all shy about unmuting yourself and asking if there's something, if we're going too fast, or if you can put a question in the chat window. So if this were a normal election, we would have just counted everybody's first choices, and the cat would be the winner, right? Because it has the most first choice votes. But like Trenton said, because this is a ranked choice election, we insist that the winner hasn't won until they have more than half the votes. So what happens next, Trenton?
Right, so what we will do now is that we will find the candidate with the least amount of votes, first place votes, that is the cow, and that candidate clearly is not the preferred choice of the people. And so what we do is we eliminate that candidate, and then everybody who voted for cow, we are going to look at those ballots and we're going to move their vote to whoever their second choice was. And so you'll see we had 6 people who chose cow as their first choice. One of those people had horse as their second choice. 2 of them had otter. 1 had dog, and 2 had cat. And so
again,
we are transferring the vote to their second choice.
So when Trenton and I do this in the room, and people are moving around, and you can see that if you were a person who voted for cat first, you're going to stay with cat. Your candidate did not get eliminated, so you're still in the cat corner. And same with the 25 people who voted for dog, they're all staying right where they started. It's only those 6 people who voted for cow, they're the only ones who are going to now go to their second choice. It's really cool because they didn't waste their vote, did they, for cow? Their voice is still going to matter in this election, even though their candidate's going to get eliminated.
Right.
But now what?
Yeah, so now we're in round 2, and unfortunately we still have no candidate with 51% or 51 votes. And so we repeat the same process. This time we're going to eliminate horse, and everybody who voted for horse, their vote is going to move to whoever their next choice was. And so in round 3, we are closer to a 51% majority, but again, no candidate has that. And so we will do it one more time. We will eliminate otter and reallocate those votes. And now we have cat with 66 votes. Cat is the majority approved candidate, and they are declared the winner in our ranked choice voting election.
Okay. So that's how ranked choice voting works behind the scenes. Of course, the voters only just need to rank their candidates and turn in their ballot. They don't have to do all this ballot counting. But so Trenton, could it ever happen that, like in this election, the cat had the most votes in the first round, and the cat still won at the end of the election? Could it ever happen that a candidate that's not in the lead after the first round ends up winning?
Absolutely. For example, the 22 or up to now 27 people who had voted for otter by the 3rd round, if their next choice happened to be dog, that definitely could have put dog over the 51% of votes, and the dog could have been the winner in that case. And I see that we had a question from Leslie.
Yes, so supposing dog and otter had each 27 votes in round 3.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
If there's ties, how do you handle ties, basically? Go ahead, Trenton, you want to take that?
Yeah, so luckily ties are pretty rare, especially once we get to a larger scale. With only 100 voters, it's more likely to happen, but in the city of Spokane, we had something like 30,000 people vote. So very uncommon. However, it does happen, and we do see ties happen in our current election system, and it really comes down to, I think in Washington State, they like flip a coin, or they
That's right.
they put like a ball in a jug or something. They do some weird thing to be a tiebreaker, but that process would not change with ranked choice voting.
Actually, I can say a few more things. Actually, Leslie, right near you, Ferndale City Council actually had to flip a coin at the end of the 2019 general election because they ended up with a tie. That they do a hand count and they double check and see if it's really. Anyway, so in this particular case, if we had a tie in round 3 between dog and otter, let's say, then the rules say that what you do is you look at the previous round and see which of those two candidates was ahead in the previous round, and that becomes the winner. That's how you break the tie. If you have a tie in the very first round, then you have to have some sort of a random tie breaking, like a coin flip, just like in our current elections. And every place that uses ranked choice voting has tie breaking rules built into the system. It's no more or no less of a problem than in our current method of voting.
Thank you.
That's a great question. Okay.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
No worries.
Cool.
That's why there's two of us.
Yeah.
Good.
Any other questions before we move on to some of the benefits of ranked choice voting?
I'll just say one more thing, which if we stop and think, and this is just looking forward, Trent, it may be fun to get that slide up again with the Oregon Democratic the Oregon governor's race. But if you call that back into your mind, you all can remember that the two conservative candidates who together had split the vote, I just thought it might help to just look at that again. We can see that in this case, the candidate Roberts, who had the most votes in the first round, is very unlikely to have been the ranked choice winner, because very likely the people who voted for Mobley first would have had Frohnmeyer as their second choice. So this is the kind of example where the person who's ahead in the first round isn't necessarily the winner in a ranked choice election, because ranked choice solves that whole vote splitting problem. Okay. Well, let's look at some of the benefits of ranked choice voting.
Yeah, and for me, the first one is, and I think one of the most important ones, is really just getting to vote with your heart, voting for the candidate that you want to vote for. You don't have to vote strategically. You don't have to try and think about who other people are going to vote for. Just vote for the person that you want.
It eliminates that lesser of two evils calculation that people end up having to do.
Absolutely.
Like if you were a person who voted for cow in that election we just saw, that you're even when your candidate gets eliminated, your vote is still going to count for your next choice.
Yeah, and because you get to vote for who you really want, and you don't have to try and think strategically and narrow down to who actually has a shot of winning. Often we see a lot more options and a lot more choices in the amount of people who decide to run and the diversity of people who run for office.
It's like that top two Apple market that we were talking about earlier and kind of chuckling about, not very interesting. Well, our general election ballot in Washington State always just has two choices. It's just two candidates. Well, we don't need to narrow the field down to just two choices if we use ranked choice. We can have more choices and still make sure that the winner has a majority of support. And as Trent mentioned, also like in that state treasurer's race in 2016, where we had those three Democrats who were all running and split up the vote so that only the two Republicans advanced to the general election. Those three Democrats under the current system, they face a lot of pressure not to run. Their parties definitely gives them a lot of pressure not to run. But with ranked choice, that wouldn't be the case. People can run knowing that they aren't going to be damaging other like-minded candidates. So those are some of the reasons why you do see more choices on your ballot in ranked choice elections, and your vote is stronger. Your voice is more powerful. You get more say. You can have an input on all the candidates by giving your rankings.
Yeah, and a good example here is this picture. This is the 2017 mayoral candidates for Minneapolis, which is a city that uses ranked choice voting. And you can see that there's a large group of people running for this office, but also just diversity of background and experiences that are up here running for office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on to the next slide. So all of this is better for the voters because we know that polling says that more than 40% of Americans don't identify with either one of the two political parties. And right now, we're pretty much locked into voting for the lesser of the two evils, one of the two major party candidates. And that's, this partisan polarization just is getting worse and worse and worse. And ranked choice voting is one of the things that can help give a voice to the people who are not, part of the narrow base of either of these two parties.
Yeah, I mean, when we have such a dominant force in our political environment of two parties, it's kind of natural that they're going to become divided and polarized, and it shouldn't be that way when 40% of the population doesn't identify as either one. We should have 40% of either independent or third parties to bridge that gap between the two major parties, because that's how the American people identify themselves as being. So it only makes sense to be able to resolve that. With that polarization that we get between the two parties, you often see a big amount of negative campaigning, attack ads, and people just pushing against each other. And this is another thing that ranked choice voting discourages. Our current voting system encourages it because you really have to either convince someone that they have made the wrong decision by choosing the candidate that they were going to vote for, or you have to turn them off of the political process so much that they just want to stay home and they don't even want to vote. And so
hold on, Trenton, hold on. This is like, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here. So ranked choice voting isn't negative how can ranked choice voting solve negative campaigning? I mean, isn't that just an inevitable part of politics? Politics, negative campaigning, they just go together, don't they?
I think it is to some extent. I think we're always going to have some kind of attack. You can't get rid of it with politics, but our current system rewards that negative campaigning. With ranked choice voting, what you are rewarded for is by competing for someone's second vote, second choice. And that is what you are most rewarded for. So when you're out walking along the street and you see you're out knocking on doors to try and get someone to vote for you, and you see a yard sign for your opponent, currently you're just going to walk on by. You're not going to waste your time trying to convince them. But in ranked choice voting, you might want to go knock on their door and ask for that person's second choice and try to appeal to that person of the other political party or of a different ideology than you.
Hey, we've got a question from Tony.
Yeah, this is a question more about the last slide and alleviating political division and polarization.
Yeah.
And I've heard America referred, people refer America as a two-party country. Would ranked choice voting turn us into a multi-party country? Because I know it wouldn't turn us into like a parliamentary system, but what would it?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer it super quick, and then we can talk a little bit more in the Q&A time afterwards. Briefly, ranked choice voting does give voice to voters who want to vote for non-establishment candidates. So a candidate, for example, Leslie knows a guy, Stony Bird, who ran for the Green Party in her hometown, and candidates who are from third parties and independents certainly have more chance of having their supporters be able to give voice and support them in ranked choice elections. That said, Australia serves as an example of a country that has had ranked choice voting for a long time and has not. We don't see evidence that there would be a wholesale shift to multiple parties. It takes a little bit more. We can talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A time. But one of the things we want to be super careful not to oversell. So ranked choice voting is not going to turn by itself as the sole reform isn't going to turn the U.S. into a thriving multi-party democracy, but it does take a step in that direction.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, currently our system almost makes it impossible for third parties or independents to emerge. This at least makes it possible if it's a good candidate or if it's a strong person who's running. We also have another question here from Nancy. Nancy, I could read this, or if you want to just ask your question over the call.
You can read it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Nancy said she was not fond of any of the other candidates in her last state rep race, and she only wanted to vote for the one. And so she asked if she could choose to do that, just to only vote once and then not rank any other candidates.
I am so glad you asked that question, Nancy, because we forgot to emphasize that when you have a ranked choice ballot, you never are required to rank. You may vote for as many candidates as you could support. And if that's only one, that's fine. And so, in fact, ranked choice voting doesn't require people to change the way they vote. If they want to still vote for one, that's fine. But you can see by the way that we took you through that one example of voting for the favorite animal, that your vote will have the potential to carry more weight if you do rank. So we always encourage people to rank as many as they like. But if you don't like somebody, you don't have to rank them. Absolutely not. Yeah. Okay, let's pick back up here with how ranked choice voting addresses negative campaigning, because as Trenton said, it's very intriguing to watch it's not theoretical. When you look at how candidates are campaigning in cities that are using ranked choice voting, candidates behave differently. And these two candidates are actually both competing with each other to be the mayor of San Francisco. Mark Leno, Jane Kim are both candidates for mayor, but they realized that they had enough overlap in their policy views that they would benefit from campaigning together and from going to the voters and saying, vote for one of us first and the other in second place. That was their pitch. And the voters had some other ideas, and a different person actually won that race. London Breed is now the mayor of San Francisco, and she's the first African-American woman to lead that city. But this style of campaigning where candidates are recognizing that they actually want to appeal to the people who will be voting for their opponents first is absolutely changing the culture of campaigning in cities that are using ranked choice. It's making them much more civil and issues focused. Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to touch on a couple of some of these other options just real quickly?
Sure. The benefits that we've just described are certainly the ones that rise to the top of the list for most voters in our state. But here's a collection of additional benefits. Ranked choice voting, there are really a lot of reasons to like it. We are seeing more women and people of color running and getting elected in ranked choice races. There's a lot of data showing that that's really happening. Ranked choice elections can save costs when primaries are eliminated, which is a common way that cities use ranked choice, is they actually eliminate a primary and run a single high turnout general election. Candidates who are right now, it's easy to predict what candidate is going to win an election by just looking at how much money they raised, because it's usually the case that the person who has the most money wins elections nowadays. But it's interesting that in ranked choice elections, that's not turning out to be the case. We're seeing more and more candidates win who didn't necessarily have the most money in their campaign war chest. And we can talk a little bit about why that is. Voter turnout, as Trenton said, is generally higher in ranked choice elections. We don't know for sure yet that that's cause and effect, but it is correlated, a higher voter turnout in places that are using ranked choice. And then finally, this benefit that I want to mention, we don't have time to really fully go into it today, but there's a way of using ranked choice voting to elect multiple winners in one race. For example, if there are 3 open seats on your city council, you can elect all 3 of those winners just by asking the voters to rank their choices. If there's, say, 10 people running for city council, the voters rank them and you pick the top 3. And that particular way of using ranked choice voting has some tremendously positive benefits, one of them being that it renders gerrymandering ineffective.
So Lisa, with all of these benefits and some of the stuff that we've been calling out here, Why is it that we're still stuck on our old system of elections? Like, why are we
Oh
still?
my gosh, isn't that the question of the hour? Why on earth haven't we switched to ranked choice voting a long time ago? Yeah, it's change is hard, isn't it? We get used to the way that we've been doing things, and to break out of that rut can be challenging. Even when, for example, the method that we use to what's called a plurality or first past the post voting, where we just pick one, that's as old as our nation, and most countries that inherited that way of voting, like Australia, Ireland, Scotland, New Zealand, most of those countries that inherited that same way of voting from England have long since moved on to a better proportional, or a preferential, a ranking method. Yeah. So we have a little cartoon, don't we, there, Trenton, to kind of capture the idea.
Yeah, so maybe is it just that we're not used to the fact that we don't recognize the fact that our voting system is so bad?
I think so, yeah. People just don't realize how outdated it is and how it's just not serving us very well because we're so used to it. We're just so used to it.
Well, the good news is people are starting to wake up, and there's a lot of action going on. So you mentioned Maine in 2016. Should we talk about some of the other places that are starting to use ranked choice voting?
Yeah, why don't you tell us about some of these?
The one that I'm most excited about, last year in 2019, the city of New York decided to adopt ranked choice voting, and that, I believe, tripled the amount of people in that one day that will be using ranked choice voting going forward. And so they elect a new mayor in 2021, and that's going to be a really big election just to see how that turns out. I'm very interested to follow some of that. We've talked about the cities of Minneapolis and San Francisco. I think Oakland is another city that uses it. And then a couple of these other states use them for different methods of election. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, so let's see. One interesting thing that's happening right now in this period of time is that 4 states are using ranked choice voting in the Democratic 2020 presidential primaries. And those are Alaska and Hawaii and Kansas and Wyoming.
Yeah, and it's a shame that those are all states that are later on in the process. We're already down to just 2 candidates. I would have been very intrigued to have seen one of those states go early, the first 4, because I think it would have been really cool to see what happened under ranked choice voting when there was still 10 or 12 candidates in the race.
And I just want to be clear that Maine is the only one of all these orange colored states that is using ranked choice statewide. All the other places have, 1 or more cities or counties that are using it. But an interesting collection is those southern states, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina. Those states use ranked choice voting also in a kind of an unusual way. Those are states that have runoff elections if no candidate has more than half the votes, and so those states send a ranked choice ballot to all of their military and overseas voters, so that those voters don't end up missing out on being able to participate in the runoff election. They ask those voters, hey, go ahead and give us your first choice just like normal, but in case there's a runoff, let us know who your second and third choices are and so on, so that we can count your vote in the runoff if there is one. Okay, let's see, what's next?
Yeah, so the big question, why are we here, the 2 of us, we're here giving this presentation to you all, and we thank you all for being able to join us. But we are trying to bring ranked choice voting to Washington State. And so we're working on a couple of those processes there. And that's why we would like to ask for your all help in that.
Yep, and in keeping with the billing of this this webinar, it's just 1 hour. It's really a general introduction to ranked choice voting. We aren't spending a ton of time on our plan here, but we can take some Q&A time. So I just made 1 slide to give you a big picture idea. Just know that Trenton and I are thrilled to tell you lots and lots and lots of more about what we're working on. We're happy to take Q&A time. And if at the end of all this you think you'd like to get involved, then you'll be able to learn a lot more about the details of what we're doing. But just broadly, we're working on 2 different levels. on the local level to bring ranked choice voting to local elections, city, county, school board, other sorts of local elections. And in order to do that, we're working on a bill in the legislature. We have a bill that we've been working on for a couple years now, and it's called the Local Options for Ranked Choice Voting Bill. It will get a new bill number when we bring it back in 2021. It's done well. It's got nearly a third of the House as co-sponsored this last time through. I can tell you lots more about it if you're interested. But we need, briefly, the big picture is that we need that piece of legislation to pass in order to allow local jurisdictions in our state to try ranked choice voting. Because the top two primary is state law right now, and until the local options bill makes it possible for cities to try ranked choice voting, they can't. So that's an important piece of our work. Trenton, you want to talk about the statewide and federal level?
Yeah, if we are unable to get the bill passed through the legislature, we are hoping to push for a ballot initiative here in Washington State, very similar to what the state of Maine did. We have ballot initiatives here in the state, and that is, I believe, personally, I think that's the most successful route we're going to have. I think our state legislature is a good opportunity to educate our representatives, but I think the best way to get something like this passed is to bring it before the people and have them weigh in on it. So that is something that we are planning, I believe, for 2021. And we'll start collecting signatures for that around this time next year.
Yep, about a year from now. And that initiative would likely target statewide and federal races, whereas the local options bill then would be for the local races. So we actually really need both. We'll be working on both strategies. And again, we can do more Q&A time if people are interested in that. Okay, we just got a couple more quick slides about FairVote Washington and what we're doing. We are, if we haven't made this clear from the beginning, we are absolutely nonpartisan in our efforts. This is a nonpartisan reform, and we are a nonprofit here in Washington State. Trenton and I are both volunteers. And one more slide.
Yeah, I mean, we saw from the earlier examples that this issue of vote splitting affects Democrats and Republicans equally. The sword swings both ways, and it doesn't carry your political affiliation.
Yep. In fact, I noticed there are a bunch of Republicans running for governor now, and there's been some concern about vote splitting, among that group, and how are they going to sort that out? It'll be interesting to watch going forward. So some things you can do. Right now, just stepping away from today's, if you're brand new to ranked choice voting and you're not, maybe you have other things that you're devoting your volunteer time, you're not sure you're going to dive in, with both feet with FairVote Washington, there's still a bunch of things you can do just right now. And one of the simplest things is to make sure that you're signed up on our website. Go to our website, there it is, fairvotewa.org, and just put in your name and your email. That way we can count you when we go to the state legislature, and we can say, hey, we've got, 350 people in your district, and I'm speaking with a legislator on that, and it makes a big difference to them. So having a big list helps us. Let us count you by signing up. We do not spam you with email. The only complaint we get is that we don't email people often enough. So we're all volunteers.
And then the second one, please tell your friends about ranked choice voting and about this movement. What I've really learned is the biggest barrier for us at this point as we're trying to push for this is that most people have never heard of ranked choice voting, or they don't know what it is. I have heard very little people, when they learn about what it is and they understand it, very few people don't like the idea. And so it's really just about education and getting that out to the general public. So please tell your friends and family, and ask them if they've heard of ranked choice voting.
Good. And if you're interested in getting more involved, there are, Trenton, you want to just say briefly what is your role in FairVote Washington?
I have a variety of roles.
That's true.
I'm one of the chapter leads here in Spokane. So we've got a chapter here. I also do a lot of speaking events, giving similar presentations to what we just did to groups of other political organizations. So if you're involved with any other political organizations, and once the coronavirus dies down and they would like to have a guest speaker, please reach out to us. We would love to present to any other organizations that might be interested. I also work on the FairVoteWA.org website, because that's what I do in my professional life. So I contribute to the website a bit as well. So there's a variety of roles that people can hop into.
Yeah. And I was thinking particularly of your chapter lead out there in Spokane. We've got about 10 chapters around the state, and there are Facebook groups associated with some of those local groups, and those are great places to get connected. But actually, this is a really exciting time as we move to online organizing. Everybody's part of everything, so it's actually easier to get connected with us. And Trent and I did want to just emphasize too that if any of you who are listening have a group that you think would enjoy learning a little bit about ranked choice voting, whether you can invite us for 5 minutes on the meeting agenda or for a full presentation, like a full hour with your meeting, we actually don't need to wait until the coronavirus distancing is changed. We are ready to give an online presentation actually anytime. So if you've got a group that would like to hear this presentation or something similar, just let us know. And I will also add that we have, if you're like fired up and ready to go, we have an advocacy training webinar that you can also sign up for. You can find all of the scheduled events on the events page of our website. Sign up for one of our advocacy training webinars, and you'll learn how to really practice your pitch for ranked choice voting and how to be effective as you advocate for this reform. And we will be adding additional topics, and we're happy to hear if you have suggestions. But one that is coming, it's not listed on the calendar yet, but it will be within the next week or so. We're actually going to be having a letter to the editor writing workshop webinar where you sit down for about an hour and a half, get some coaching and training about how to write an effective letter to the editor, and then actually get a draft letter done during that webinar. Okay, I think we're ready. I'm ready to have us stop and let's hear Q&A time. I think we have one last slide you can flip over to, and then we can listen to.
And right off the bat, we actually have a question from Leslie. Leslie, do you want me to read it, or you want to just ask?
I could speak. I'm from Scotland. I've been here for 25 years, but my impression, looking at the way people talk about elections there and here, is that in Scotland, people were more interested in the candidates' policy positions and not just which party they belong to. People educated themselves a bit more about the candidates and the nuances of their platform. Does that seem to be happening in America where there's ranked choice voting?
Yeah, I'll take this one real quick. That's a great point, and I actually had the opportunity to speak to the Spokane City Council about ranked choice voting, and one of the people there who was watching the presentation made this very similar point. He was from somewhere on the East Coast in a city that had adopted ranked choice voting at one point, and he said that they—
It was New York, actually. It was New York. Yeah.
He said that they had found that with ranked choice voting in place, the voters were constantly asking for more information about the candidates and trying to educate themselves more about what the candidates themselves were advocating for. And so I do think that's a common occurrence and a very likely additional benefit of changing our voting system.
It is well documented that the campaigns right now today in the cities that are using ranked choice voting are more civil and more focused on issues. There's a lot of research that's supporting that. But in addition, we sort of circling back a little bit to the question about the multiple parties that we got before. When ranked choice voting is used in that multi-winner way to, like I said, if you had 3 open seats in your city council and you're able to ask the voters to rank all 10 candidates who are running and just elect all 3 of those representatives in the single election. There are a bunch of benefits. Again, this time that we have right now is a little short to go into the details on that, but that method of ranked choice voting, what's called sometimes multi-winner, is associated with a much broadening of the parties and more opportunity for non-mainstream parties to prevail. Yeah, great questions. Let's see, I was gonna...
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was campaigning for Andrew Yang this spring, someone in Tacoma told me about how ranked choice voting was a thing here, and then it went away. And I was wondering if you guys had any history on why it went away.
That's a very good question, and in fact, I should put that right on one of the slides and make sure that we address that directly, along with the question that we should make sure we address, which is like, what are the common arguments against ranked choice voting? So one of them in here in Washington, and I'll go ahead and start this, Trent, and then you be ready to jump in. But one of them is people who say, oh, what about Pierce County? I heard that Pierce County used ranked choice voting, and then the voters decided not to keep using it, and that is absolutely true. That was in 2009. Pierce County used ranked choice voting for 2 elections, and then the voters decided not to keep using it. The question about why is well addressed in a paper that, in fact, I want to send you all a follow-up email, and I'll try to remember to put that in there too. But if you want to look it up, the title of the paper is What Really Happened with Instant Runoff Voting in Pierce County, Washington. And it's a somewhat complex story, but the high-level takeaway is that the election itself went fine. There was no difficulty with the actual way that the election came off. But it was early days for ranked choice voting in the country. And as such, there were tools for doing ranked choice elections that exist now that were not available to the election administrators. So it was very expensive. They spent $1.6 million on that election. And by comparison, the state of Maine adopted ranked choice voting or implemented ranked choice voting statewide for just over $100,000, so about 1/15 of the cost. So costs have come down, and logistical tools, hardware, software for implementing the elections have gotten much more accessible. So those are the main reasons why Pierce County stepped away from it. There were more. One of them had to do with Top 2, which the voters of Washington had recently approved, but was then on hold, had gone all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court before the Supreme Court agreed that it could go forward, it was constitutional. And while that was on hold was when Pierce County decided to try ranked choice voting, because Pierce County didn't want to get stuck having to register by party. People didn't want to have to pick a party stuff. Those of you who have been to Washington for a while can remember that whole big fight. It went on for several years. And Pierce County tried ranked choice voting during that time. And then as soon as Top 2 became available, Pierce County said, oh, well, we don't have to pick a party anymore, so we're okay. We don't really need ranked choice voting after all. So some of the story.
Thank you.
Sure. What else? So let's talk briefly, and just jump in if you've got another question. But Trenton, what would you say are some of the common objections besides, oh, they used it in Pierce County?
The one I hear, and I generally hear it from people who I think are already not interested, but you hear that it's a confusing method of voting. And my response to that is that it can be confusing if you're the people counting the votes, but the process of actually ranking your choices is something that we do as people constantly. I don't think being able to just rank your options is that complicated of a process. And breaking it down into how do we actually count that up is the process that we walked through a little bit earlier. And that's really just what the auditor and those who work at the auditor's office do. And so I find that to maybe be a disingenuous opposition that I hear. And to me, I don't agree that it's that confusing.
I read an article yesterday, and the woman said, any kindergarten child can tell you their top 3 toys and which one's their favorite, and adults have opinions too. So it typically is not confusing for voters, but that is a complaint that you'll hear, is that ranked choice voting is going to be too confusing. And the other set of complaints or concerns or opposition usually centers around cost and logistics, just that there will be implementation costs, there will be some logistical challenges as we transition to a different method. There's just no question about that. It's absolutely true. The costs are in the tens of thousands of dollars, certainly nothing extraordinary. That there's potential for cost savings over time when primaries are eliminated. In fact, New York City chose to use ranked choice voting in part because it will save them a lot of money, and it's not small change. They're going to save on the order of $20 million every time they eliminate a runoff election because they are using ranked choice voting. So there are a lot of good solutions for the cost and logistic objections to ranked choice voting that exist now. All right. Other questions at all? We have time for, I think, how are we just double checking the time? What have we got here?
I think
we're
we
just
have
about there. Yeah, we could definitely do.
The concern I have, Nancy Kerner here, is that it's not transparent. I mean, any kindergarten kid can count piles of paper with number 1 and make that pile, and I guess. But when you get into the second and third ranked, it seems less transparent and requiring a computer. And and even the legislative fiscal note that was on this year's bill admitted it would cost a minimum of $100,000, as I remember, to implement it, even just to develop the software for it.
Right. Well, we respectfully disagree with that fiscal note. If you looked at the underlying data, again, the experiences I think that were in the data points there were from Santa Fe and Maine, and I'm trying to remember, there was a third one, which are considerably less than the Secretary of State's office was suggesting. But even if the costs were higher, again, the potential for recouping those costs comes pretty quickly over time. And when you look at, for example, Utah's implementation, had 2 cities that just implemented in November of 2019. They were able to do it for no additional cost, and now every election going forward, they're going to be saving because they don't have to have that additional round of voting. But briefly on the complication and the transparency is really, really good question, really good point. We were so fortunate that Matt Dunlap, the Secretary of State in Maine, really essentially went first in the national spotlight. And Maine, under his leadership, developed beautiful methods of making very transparent to all the reporters and all the voters through that process, just exactly how the votes came out in each round, how the votes were transferred, and it really did go well. There really were no difficulties or questions with that. Ranked choice elections have to be subject to audits just as any other election, so that you can go back and recreate those results. And in fact, because of the incredibly effective transparency of that first statewide Maine election, anybody in the country could get hold of all the data of what was on those ballots in Maine and recreate with an Excel spreadsheet the exact outcome down to the precise number of votes. So I think that that isn't actually a concern that lives at all strongly.
It also smacks of something that happened. And granted, they were moving people around in the Iowa caucus, but there was a whole bunch of first choice, second choice, third choice. Okay, and so where did you end up? And that took a long time to figure out.
Yeah. So I actually consider caucuses to be kind of a primitive form of ranked choice voting. They are much more kind of wild because they have people come to this location and then they have them all move around and change their votes and try and convince each other. But the concept of vote once and then if someone's not viable, you get to move to your second choice, that is kind of the benefit of ranked choice voting. It's just that when they do the caucus in the way that they do caucus, it's just so much crazier. And so I think of ranked choice voting as like a better version because you're just putting on a ballot. There's no convincing someone to change your vote. You don't have to go to a location. You just fill it out on that ballot while still getting the advantage that a caucus offers by being able to transfer your vote if your candidate isn't viable.
Yeah, perfect.
Kind of once and done then.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll just add too that ranked choice ballots can absolutely be hand counted. In fact, Minneapolis hand counted for years, and it's kind of fun if you. I don't know if any of you have listened to the Radio Lab podcast called Tweak the Vote. Radio Lab, Tweak the Vote. We can put that in the follow-up too. And it actually takes you to a ranked choice election that's happening in Ireland, and where they hand count the ballots. They do it on purpose because they kind of like the whole kind of social process of doing that hand count. So they start by making piles of all the first choice votes, and then they look to see if they have a majority winner. And if they don't, then they take the pile of the loser and redistribute those ballots to those voters' second choices, and then they count again, and so on. So it's quite possible to do it very transparently too. But great question, Nancy. Thank you for bringing that one up. All right, folks, we have reached time, and I'm actually happy to stay on for a couple more minutes if anybody has more questions, but I wanted to thank you all for coming and encourage you to come find us again, sign up, and come to more of our webinars and get involved. We're glad to have you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is Tony. I just wanted to say thanks. Yeah, this was a good introduction for me. And I'm signed up for the call tomorrow for advocacy.
Oh, good. Good. Tomorrow, let's see, tomorrow, is that that's in the evening, right? Tomorrow evening.
6:30, yeah.
Great, good. And that's with Cassandra Allen, our field director, and she does a really nice job. It's more interactive within this one. This is a little bit of a presentation.
All right, cool. Well, thanks,
you. Thanks, Tony. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Glad to have any more questions if folks have anything else. There's some great questions today.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, good. Thank you, Chris, for putting the video in. And I wanted to, I've been thinking, Chris, that we should get a list of videos because the fact that we aren't able to have people in person, I think makes the video even more valuable. Yeah. I don't know. In Trenton, we could talk about whether we think it makes sense to include a video right in the presentation. We took it out, but I'm of two minds.